Welcome to Books Arena. Today, we are diving into one of the most influential psychology books of our time, Thinking, Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. This book is a masterclass in understanding how our minds work, how we make decisions, and how our thinking can both help and mislead us in everyday life. Daniel Kahneman is not just a writer, he is a Nobel Prize-winning psychologist whose work has transformed economics, medicine, law, and public policy. What he gives us in this book is a window into the two systems that drive the way we think, System 1 and System 2. System 1 is fast, automatic, and emotional. It is the part of your brain that helps you finish familiar sentences, swerve when a car cuts in front of you, or make a quick judgment about someone you just met. It operates effortlessly and is always running in the background. System 1 is like a reflex. It is useful, but it is also prone to errors. System 2 is slow, deliberate, and logical. It kicks in when you solve a difficult math problem, write a business email, or try to remember where you parked your car at the airport. System 2 is the mental muscle that requires effort, attention, and focus. It helps you make rational decisions, but it is lazy. It only activates when it absolutely has to. Kahneman explains that while we like to think of ourselves as rational, most of the time, we are not. We rely far more on System 1, our fast, intuitive thinking, and this can lead to cognitive biases, poor decisions, and misunderstandings. For example, imagine you are buying a car. The salesperson tells you the original price is 10 Indian rupees lakhs but offers a discount to bring it down to 8.5 Indian rupees lakhs. You might feel like you are getting a great deal, but your fast thinking is being manipulated by what Kahneman calls the anchoring effect. You are anchored to the original number, even though the actual value of the car may be much lower. In Thinking, Fast and Slow, we are not just reading a psychology book, we are confronting ourselves. We are learning why we fall for marketing tricks, why we misjudge risks, why we make snap decisions in love or in work, and why confidence does not always equal competence. Real-life stories and experiments throughout the book make the lessons relatable and unforgettable. From the Israeli judges who unknowingly gave harsher sentences before lunch, to financial experts who consistently overestimate their predictions, Kahneman shows how even the smartest people are vulnerable to cognitive traps. This audiobook will take you through the major concepts in the book, broken down into easy-to-follow parts, with examples that relate to daily life, business, relationships, and more. By the end, you will not only recognize your own thinking patterns, you will also learn how to challenge them, slow down, and make better decisions. So, let us begin the journey into the science of the mind. This is Thinking, Fast and Slow, simplified, structured, and brought to you here, only on Books Arena. The human mind is a remarkable machine. But it does not always work the way we think it does. Daniel Kahneman begins the book by introducing the two systems that govern our thinking. System 1 is fast, intuitive, and emotional. System 2 is slow, effortful, and logical. These two systems are always active but not equally. Most of the time, we are in System 1 mode. It helps us respond to immediate threats, read facial expressions, or drive on familiar roads. For example, if you see a snake while walking, you jump back before you even have time to think. That is System 1. It acts quickly, often without conscious control. System 2 comes in when something requires deeper attention. Solving a math problem like 23 times 47 is a task for System 2. It requires you to pause, focus, and calculate. But here is the thing, System 2 is lazy. It does not like to be activated unless it absolutely has to be. So, in many situations, System 1 takes over even when it should not. This is where our thinking can go wrong. Kahneman introduces one of the key ideas in the book, cognitive bias. This is when our thinking is distorted, usually by relying too much on System 1. One powerful example is the priming effect. It shows how subtle cues can influence our behavior without us realizing it. In an experiment, people were asked to solve word puzzles that involved elderly-related words like Florida, bingo, and wrinkle. After finishing the task, those who had seen the elderly-themed words actually walked slower when leaving the room, as if their brains had associated the words with old age and changed their behavior. That is the power of System 1. It is fast and automatic, but it is also easily influenced. Another important idea is the law of least effort. The mind, just like the body, is always trying to save energy. This is why we form habits. It is why we take shortcuts in thinking, and why we often believe the first thing that comes to mind even if it is wrong. Consider this example: What is heavier, a kilogram of steel or a kilogram of cotton? Most people instinctively say steel. It feels obvious. But a kilogram is a kilogram, the weight is the same. It is just our system one playing tricks, because it thinks about density and texture, not actual weight. Kahneman shares another compelling story. Two groups of students were asked the same question in different ways. Group 1 was asked, is the height of the tallest redwood more or less than 1,200 feet? What do you think the actual height is? Group 2 was asked, is the height of the tallest redwood more or less than 180 feet? What do you think the actual height is? The first group gave much higher estimates than the second group. This is the anchoring effect in action. The number presented in the question influences the answer even though it should not. Anchoring is everywhere in pricing, negotiations, salaries. If someone tells you a product originally costs 5,000 Indian rupees but is now only 2,999 Indian rupees, that 5,000 Indian rupees is an anchor. It makes the lower price feel like a better deal, even if it is not. Another key point Kahneman makes is that System 1 loves stories. We are natural storytellers. When we hear facts that fit into a good narrative, we accept them easily. This is why people often believe confident speakers, even when they are wrong. We prefer a good story over a complex truth. Take the stock market. Many people follow news reports that say, the market dropped because of fears over inflation, or stocks rose today due to strong consumer confidence. These are stories, not always facts. But they sound reasonable, so we believe them. System 1 likes neat explanations, even when the reality is messy. The danger is that these stories can lead to overconfidence. We often feel we understand the world better than we really do. This is called the illusion of understanding. It is what makes people think they can predict elections, markets, or outcomes in sports when in fact, randomness plays a huge role. System 2 can help correct these errors. But only if we are willing to slow down and engage it. Here is a real-life example. Suppose you are hiring someone. You interview two candidates. One is confident, smiles a lot, and gives clear answers. The other is quiet, awkward, but has better qualifications. Most people will choose the first one because System 1 is judging on first impressions. But a thoughtful review of the resumes, references, and test results might show that the second candidate is a better fit. System 2 would catch that if it is used. But System 2 requires effort. And we are not always willing to put in that effort, especially when we are tired, stressed, or distracted. This is why Kahneman warns us, we must be aware of our mental shortcuts. They are useful, but they are also dangerous. In this part of the book, Kahneman is not trying to make us feel bad about our thinking. He is showing us how we think and giving us the tools to think better. When we understand how System 1 and System 2 work, we become more aware of our decisions. We can pause before reacting. We can question our first impressions. We can avoid falling for simple stories or misleading statistics. This awareness is the first step to better judgment. One of the most fascinating parts of this book is how Daniel Kahneman breaks down the way we misunderstand probability, risk, and statistics. Humans are not naturally good at thinking in numbers. Our minds are built to spot patterns, not calculate chances. And this creates serious problems in how we make decisions. Take for example the availability heuristic. This is a mental shortcut we use when we try to judge how common or likely something is. Instead of analyzing data, we ask ourselves, can I think of an example? If something is easy to remember like a plane crash, a shark attack, or a terrorist incident, we believe it is more likely to happen, even if the actual odds are very low. This is why people are often more afraid of flying than driving, even though car accidents are far more common and dangerous. Kahneman shares a powerful story. After September 11, many Americans avoided flying out of fear. As a result, more people chose to drive long distances. Ironically, this led to a measurable increase in car accident deaths because people were using a more dangerous mode of travel to avoid what felt like the bigger risk. That is the availability heuristic at work. Another common error is substitution. When faced with a difficult question, we often answer an easier one instead without realizing it. For instance, if asked, how happy are you with your life these days, that is a complex question. But you might substitute it with, what is my mood right now? If you are having a good day, you might say life is good. If something just went wrong, you might say it is not. We do not do this consciously. System 1 takes over and gives a quick answer even to a question that deserves more thought. This is also true in moral judgment. Consider a question like, is this policy fair? Instead of carefully analyzing the details, people might substitute it with, do I like the people proposing it? If the answer is yes, they assume the policy is fair. If not, they reject it regardless of the actual content. Kahneman also talks about base rate neglect, which is our tendency to ignore general information in favor of specific information, especially if it sounds personal or emotional. For example, imagine you are told that Steve is shy, likes to read, and avoids loud social situations. Then you are asked, is Steve more likely to be a librarian or a farmer? Most people say librarian. But statistically, there are far more male farmers than male librarians. That base rate, the overall number of farmers versus librarians, is more important than the personality traits. But our minds focus on the story, not the data. That is base rate neglect. It shows up in hiring, in medical decisions, even in courtrooms. People tend to overvalue personal details and undervalue statistical information, which often leads to bad decisions. Another powerful example from the book is the representativeness heuristic. This is when we judge something based on how much it resembles a typical case, even if the statistics do not support it. Imagine you meet someone who is quiet, loves poetry, and wears glasses. You are told he is either a truck driver or a professor of literature. Instinctively, many will say professor. But statistically, there are tens of thousands more truck drivers than literature professors. So even if the personality fits the image of a professor, the odds are still higher that he is a truck driver. This is the conflict between intuitive thinking and statistical thinking. Kahneman points out that when we rely only on intuition, when we let System 1 make all the calls, we are more likely to fall into these traps. But when we slow down and bring in System 2, we can check ourselves. Think about how this applies in real life. In hiring, people often trust their gut feeling about a candidate. But research shows that structured interviews and tests, even simple checklists, predict job performance better than intuition. In investing, people follow hot stocks or take advice from confident-sounding experts. But the data shows that low-cost index funds, based on long-term strategy, outperform most human traders. Even in medicine, Kahneman shares examples where doctors misdiagnosed cases because they relied on memory and experience rather than statistical tools, which could have saved lives. One of the most sobering ideas in the book is outcome bias, the tendency to judge a decision by its result rather than the quality of the decision at the time. For example, imagine a coach calls a risky play in a football game. If it works, everyone says he is a genius. If it fails, people say he is foolish. But the truth is, the decision might have been smart either way. The outcome does not always reflect the process. This is why learning to think statistically is so important. We need to separate the decision from the outcome, especially in complex, uncertain situations. Kahneman's work also helps us see how little control we actually have over our thinking. Many of these biases and errors are built into how our minds operate. We do not choose to make them, but we can choose to understand them and correct for them when it matters most. System 1 is not bad. In fact, it helps us navigate the world quickly and efficiently. But it is prone to errors, especially in situations that require logic, math, or careful judgment. System 2 can help us catch those errors if we are willing to activate it. This part of the book challenges us to look at how we make decisions every day, from what we buy, to who we trust, to how we judge risk. And it gives us a way to think better. In this part of the book, Daniel Kahneman explores the powerful concept of loss aversion, a principle that helps explain why we often act irrationally when faced with risk or uncertainty. Loss aversion is the idea that losses hurt more than gains feel good. In other words, losing 1,000 Indian rupees feels worse than the happiness you get from gaining 1,000 Indian rupees. This might sound simple, but it has profound consequences. Imagine a coin toss. If it lands heads, you win 1,000 Indian rupees. If it lands tails, you lose 800 Indian rupees. Even though the expected value is positive, most people would avoid this gamble. Why? Because the fear of loss weighs more heavily than the joy of gain. Loss aversion explains many everyday behaviors. Why do people hold on to losing stocks instead of selling? Because selling makes the loss real. Why do people stay in unhappy relationships or jobs? Because the fear of future regret feels greater than the pain of staying. Loss aversion makes us cling to the status quo even when better options are available. Kahneman introduces prospect theory, developed with his colleague Amos Tversky. It challenges the classic economic idea that people make rational choices based on value. Instead, Kahneman shows that people make decisions based on perceived gains and losses, not actual outcomes. Here is an example. Suppose you are given two options. Option A sure gain of 900 Indian rupees. Option B, a 90% chance to win 1000 Indian rupees, and a 10% chance to win nothing. Most people choose option A, the safe gain. Now, suppose you are given two other options. Option C, a sure loss of 900 Indian rupees. Option D, a 90% chance to lose 1000 Indian rupees, and a 10% chance to lose nothing. Now, most people choose option D, the risky loss. This shift in preference is not logical, but it is deeply human. We are risk-averse when it comes to gains, and risk-seeking when it comes to avoiding losses. This is a fundamental insight of prospect theory, and it explains many real-world behaviors from financial investing to consumer decisions. Kahneman also explains how people assign value based on reference points, not absolute outcomes. For example, if you expect to earn 50,000 Indian rupees in a month but only earn 45,000 Indian rupees, you feel disappointed even if that is still a solid income. But if you expected 40,000 Indian rupees and earned 45,000 Indian rupees, you feel happy. The number itself did not change. What changed was your reference point. This is why expectations shape our happiness more than actual circumstances. Another powerful concept Kahneman discusses is the endowment effect, the tendency to overvalue things we own simply because we own them. In an experiment, participants were given coffee mugs and then asked how much they would sell them for. Others were asked how much they would pay to buy the same mugs. The sellers demanded almost twice as much as the buyers were willing to pay. Why? Because once something is ours, it feels more valuable. This affects not just small decisions, but also major ones like pricing a home, negotiating a salary, or letting go of possessions. Think about this in everyday life. People often keep clothes they never wear, gadgets they never use, or subscriptions they no longer need. Letting go feels like a loss, even if it brings no benefit. This emotional weight of ownership influences many financial and lifestyle choices. Kahneman then turns to the topic of framing, how the way information is presented can change our decisions, even if the facts remain the same. Imagine two statements about a medical procedure. Statement 1, the survival rate is 90%. Statement 2, the mortality rate is 10%. They are mathematically identical, but people feel much more comfortable with the first one. That is the power of framing. Our emotions respond to how something sounds, not just what it means. Advertisers, politicians, and marketers use framing all the time. Words are carefully chosen to trigger specific reactions. For instance, a tax might be called a contribution, or a fee might be labeled a convenience charge. These subtle choices shape how we feel and how we act. Kahneman gives another example from a legal context. If a judge is told, this crime has a maximum sentence of 20 years, versus, this crime usually gets a 5-year sentence, the final judgment could differ. Even expert professionals are affected by framing, because System 1 reacts emotionally before System 2 kicks in logically. One of the most humbling lessons of this part is that context matters more than we think. We do not make decisions in a vacuum. Our choices are shaped by how questions are asked, what options are available, and what expectations we carry into the situation. Kahneman's research shows that even trained experts, doctors, judges, investors fall into these traps. It is not about intelligence. It is about being human. That is why awareness is so important. When you know that your brain values losses more than gains, you can pause before rejecting a risky but worthwhile opportunity. When you realize that the way something is framed affects your reaction, you can reframe it for yourself and see it more clearly. This part of thinking, fast and slow, reveals the hidden forces that drive so many of our decisions: fear of loss, emotional attachment, poor risk assessment, and the influence of language. By understanding these forces, we gain more control over how we respond to the world. In this section, Daniel Kahneman introduces one of the most striking and thought-provoking ideas in the book, the concept of the two selves, the experiencing self and the remembering self. The experiencing self is the part of you that lives in the present moment. It feels your emotions as they happen: the joy of laughter, the sting of criticism, the taste of your favorite food. It lives minute by minute. The remembering self, on the other hand, is the part of you that writes your life story. It reflects, judges, compares, and forms opinions about what happened. The remembering self is what we rely on when we answer questions like, was that a good vacation, or am I happy with my life? What Kahneman discovered is that these two selves do not always agree and that the remembering self often takes over. For example, consider a vacation where everything was enjoyable: the weather, the food, the activities. But on the last day, you lose your passport and spend hours at the embassy. The remembering self might conclude, that vacation was a disaster. The painful ending overshadows all the good days that came before. This phenomenon is known as the peak end rule. It states that our memories of experiences are shaped not by how long they lasted or how they averaged out, but by the most intense moment, the peak, and how they ended. In one study, patients undergoing a painful medical procedure were asked to rate their pain in real time, and then later, to recall the overall experience. Some patients had a longer procedure, but the end was made slightly more comfortable. Strangely, those patients remembered the experience more positively even though they suffered for longer. The more gentle ending softened the memory. This shows how memory is not a perfect recorder. It is a storyteller. And sometimes, the story it tells distorts reality. Understanding the difference between the experiencing self and the remembering self can change how we make decisions. For example, people often go on trips or attend events not because they enjoy them in the moment, but because they want the memory. We chase moments that photograph well, not necessarily those that feel good as they happen. It also influences how we define happiness. Kahneman draws a powerful distinction between experienced happiness and remembered happiness. Experienced happiness is how content you feel throughout your daily life. Remembered happiness is how you feel about your life when you think about it. Studies have shown that these two forms of happiness can diverge. A person might be smiling often and enjoying their daily routine, yet feel unsatisfied when asked to assess their life as a whole. Or someone might feel stressed day to day, but look back with pride on what they accomplished. This insight challenges how we think about well-being. It raises the question, should we focus on improving the moments we live through, or the memories we keep? Kahneman explains that society tends to reward the remembering self. Awards, recognition, life narratives, they are all based on what we remember, not what we lived. But this often leads people to make choices that favor future memories over present enjoyment. For instance, a person might choose a prestigious but stressful job because it sounds impressive and will make a good story even if they are miserable in the role. Or they might plan an extravagant wedding to impress others, even though the stress of planning and debt outweigh the joy of the day. One real-life example comes from people who run marathons. Many do not enjoy the physical pain during the race, but they look back with pride. They treasure the memory, not the experience itself. This does not mean we should ignore the remembering self, but we should be aware of how much control it has. By understanding these two perspectives, we can make better, more balanced decisions. Kahneman also explores how time is perceived differently by the two selves. The experiencing self is affected by duration; it feels the passage of time. But the remembering self ignores time. This explains why a short, intense experience can be more memorable than a long, mild one. Think of a 2-hour concert that builds to a powerful, emotional ending, versus a 5-hour workshop that is mildly interesting throughout but never peaks. Most people will remember the concert more fondly even though it was shorter. This has implications for how we design experiences in education, healthcare, travel, and even entertainment. If you want someone to remember something positively, focus on creating a powerful peak and a gentle ending. Another insight from Kahneman's work is that we often confuse being happy in your life with being happy about your life. The first is about your day-to-day feelings. The second is about your overall sense of meaning, success, or satisfaction. You might feel tired and frustrated after a long week of parenting, but when you reflect, you feel proud and fulfilled. Or you might feel relaxed during a holiday, but when you reflect, you feel like the time was wasted. This duality shows why well-being is complex. There is no single number or score that captures it. Happiness depends not just on what happens to us, but on how we interpret and remember it. Daniel Kahneman encourages us to pay more attention to the experiencing self. After all, it is the one actually living our lives. If we only live for the story, we may miss the joy of the moment. By recognizing the difference between our two selves, we can make choices that serve both enjoying the present and building memories we are proud of. This part of the book helps us see our internal world more clearly. It reminds us that the way we remember life can differ greatly from how we experience it. And that understanding this difference is a step toward wiser, more satisfying decisions. In this part of the book, Daniel Kahneman explores the concept of overconfidence, a cognitive bias that affects our decision-making across personal, professional, and global matters. Overconfidence is the tendency to overestimate our knowledge, our predictions, and our ability to control outcomes even when evidence suggests otherwise. This is a deep flaw in our judgment, and Kahneman shows how it stems from the way System 1 constructs coherent stories out of incomplete information. When we make decisions, we often do not pause to consider all the facts. Instead, we form quick conclusions based on what feels right. Kahneman calls this what you see is all there is, or wizziating. Our mind tends to ignore what it does not know and builds confidence from the information it has, no matter how limited that may be. For example, if you hear that a startup founder is charismatic, confident, and has worked at big companies before, you might confidently predict that the startup will succeed even if you know nothing about the market, the product, or the competition. Your brain fills in the gaps and creates a compelling story. Real-life consequences of overconfidence can be serious. Consider the financial crisis of 2008. Experts, banks, and investors believed they had mastered risk through complex financial models. They felt sure of their predictions. But they were wrong. Their models did not account for rare events, and their confidence blinded them to the warning signs. The result was a global collapse. Kahneman also discusses how experts themselves are not immune to this bias. In fact, the more experienced a person becomes, the more confident they may feel even when their accuracy does not improve. He shares a famous study involving stock market analysts. Over the years, analysts made countless predictions about stock prices. Yet their success rate was no better than chance. Despite this, they remained confident in their abilities. Their predictions had the illusion of skill, but not the reality of it. This illusion of skill appears in many fields: medicine, business, politics. People trust their gut, rely on patterns that may not exist, and ignore the randomness of real-life events. Another powerful concept in this section is the narrative fallacy. Humans are natural storytellers. We love clear explanations and logical plots. But the world is often messy, random, and unpredictable. When something happens like a company's success, we try to explain it with a neat story: it succeeded because of great leadership and a bold strategy. But we ignore the role of luck, timing, and hidden variables. One famous example is Google. Today, it is one of the world's most successful companies. Many books and articles explain its rise using visionary leadership and smart decisions. But countless other startups also had brilliant founders and great ideas and still failed. Luck, timing, and circumstances played a huge role in Google's success, but those parts of the story are often left out. Kahneman warns us against falling for hindsight bias, the tendency to see events as predictable after they happen. It makes us believe we knew it all along, even if we did not. This bias not only distorts our memory but also damages our learning. If we think success or failure was obvious, we miss the deeper, more complex lessons. A key takeaway here is the planning fallacy. It is our tendency to underestimate how long tasks will take and how much they will cost, even when we have past experience telling us otherwise. Think of a time you started a project, maybe building a website, renovating your room, or preparing for exams. You might have thought, this will take a week. But in the end, it took 3 weeks and cost more than expected. That is the planning fallacy at work. Even large companies and governments fall into this trap. One example Kahneman shares is the construction of a new public building that was scheduled to take 2 years. Despite expert planning, it took over 5 years and went over budget by millions. Why? Because planners focused on best-case scenarios and ignored potential delays, obstacles, or unexpected issues. To overcome the planning fallacy, Kahneman recommends using the outside view. Instead of focusing on your unique project, look at similar past projects. What was their timeline? What problems did they face? This broader perspective helps ground our expectations in reality. Another example is students estimating how long it will take to finish their thesis. Many say a few months. But when asked how long it took others, they admit around a year. Their personal prediction is hopeful, the outside view is realistic. Kahneman urges readers to adopt more humility in their decisions. Confidence does not equal accuracy. A strong opinion does not make it true. Recognizing this can help us make more careful, thoughtful choices in business, relationships, finances, and beyond. He emphasizes that even seasoned professionals fall into the overconfidence trap. Doctors may misdiagnose. CEOs may make bold moves that backfire. Politicians may make promises they cannot keep. The problem is not lack of intelligence. It is the structure of the human mind. Being aware of our cognitive limitations is not a weakness. It is strength. It allows us to double-check our assumptions, seek other viewpoints, and respect uncertainty. In this part of the book, Kahneman invites us to be more realistic, more humble, and more open to learning. The mind craves certainty, but the world is uncertain. The sooner we accept that, the wiser our decisions will become. In this section, Daniel Kahneman introduces the concept of loss aversion, one of the most well-documented and powerful ideas in behavioral economics. It describes the human tendency to feel the pain of losses more intensely than the pleasure of gains. Simply put, losing 100 Indian rupees hurts more than gaining 100 Indian rupees feels good. This imbalance affects how we make choices and react to outcomes. Imagine a coin toss. If it lands on heads, you win 150 Indian rupees. If it lands on tails, you lose 100 Indian rupees. Statistically, the bet is in your favor, the expected value is positive. But many people would decline the offer. Why? Because the fear of loss outweighs the potential for gain. That is loss aversion in action. Kahneman explains that this fear is not just emotional, it is hardwired. Our brains treat potential losses as more significant than equivalent gains. This was an evolutionary advantage. For our ancestors, avoiding danger was often more critical than securing extra benefits. A missed opportunity might mean less food, but a bad decision could mean injury or death. In today's world, this instinct still drives our behavior, often in irrational ways. Consider the stock market. Investors hold on to losing stocks for too long, hoping they will rebound, and sell winning stocks too quickly to lock in gains. This behavior, known as the disposition effect, reflects our discomfort with realizing a loss even when logic says otherwise. Another everyday example is insurance. People pay high premiums to avoid potential losses, even if the actual risk is low. It is why extended warranties, travel insurance, and return protection plans are so popular, not because they make financial sense, but because they ease our fear of future regret. Kahneman, along with Amos Tversky, developed a theory called prospect theory to better explain this kind of decision-making under uncertainty. Unlike traditional economic models that assume humans are perfectly rational, prospect theory shows that people evaluate outcomes relative to a reference point, often their current state, and that losses loom larger than gains. This leads to inconsistent choices, depending on how options are framed. For example, imagine two scenarios. Scenario A, you are told, you will receive 1000 Indian rupees. Then you must choose between getting 500 Indian rupees more for sure, or flipping a coin. Heads you get 1000 Indian rupees more, tails you get nothing. Most people choose the sure 500 Indian rupees. It feels safer. Scenario B, you are told, you will receive 2000 Indian rupees. Then you must choose between losing 500 Indian rupees for sure, or flipping a coin. Heads you lose nothing, tails you lose Indian rupee 1000. Now, most people choose to gamble. The outcomes in both cases are mathematically identical, but the framing is different. One sounds like a gain, the other like a loss. People avoid risk when a gain is framed, but seek risk to avoid a loss. This bias can be seen in politics, marketing, and even personal relationships. For instance, a health message that says 90% of people survive the surgery is more reassuring than one that says 10% of people die, even though both mean the same thing. Marketers use loss aversion to drive sales. Phrases like "don't miss out" or "limited time only" trigger our fear of losing a benefit. Subscription services offer free trials that auto-renew, knowing we are reluctant to give up something we already have. Even gym memberships tap into this effect. People continue to pay for unused services just to avoid the feeling of losing their commitment or identity as someone who works out. Kahneman points out that ownership increases the perceived value of things, a phenomenon called the endowment effect. Once we own something, we are less willing to part with it, not because its market value has changed, but because giving it up feels like a loss. In one experiment, students were given coffee mugs and then offered a chance to sell them. On average, sellers demanded nearly twice as much as buyers were willing to pay. The mugs had become part of the seller's identity, and losing them felt painful. This principle applies to larger decisions too. Homeowners often overvalue their property simply because they own it. People cling to outdated products, subscriptions, or habits not because they are still useful, but because giving them up feels like a defeat. Loss aversion even affects our personal goals. Once we commit to a plan or path, we struggle to let go even when it no longer serves us. It is why someone may stay in an unfulfilling job or relationship. Leaving feels like a loss, even if it opens the door to better outcomes. To navigate these biases, Kahneman suggests we step back and ask, if I did not already own this or were not already committed, would I still choose it? This question forces us to evaluate our decisions more objectively. Understanding loss aversion helps us make smarter financial choices, avoid emotional traps, and recognize when we are clinging to something out of fear rather than value. It also encourages empathy. If someone resists a change or reacts strongly to a small loss, it is not always because they are stubborn or irrational. Their brain is reacting to perceived pain that can outweigh logic. By recognizing this in ourselves and others, we can communicate more effectively, design better systems, and create environments that support more balanced decisions. Kahneman's insights into loss aversion give us a window into our emotional responses to risk and reward. They remind us that behind every financial decision, every argument, and every moment of hesitation, there is a story our mind is telling, one that often favors safety over growth, and familiarity over change. In the final chapters of Thinking, Fast and Slow, Daniel Kahneman brings everything together by introducing two important ideas that help us understand how we evaluate our experiences and make long-term decisions: the experiencing self and the remembering self. These two selves do not always agree, and this disagreement has a big impact on how we live our lives. The experiencing self is the one that lives through each moment. It is the part of us that feels the warmth of the sun, the taste of our food, or the annoyance of a traffic jam. It lives in the present. The remembering self, on the other hand, is the storyteller. It looks back, creates narratives, and decides how good or bad an experience was overall. It is the remembering self that makes decisions about the future, like where to vacation again or what kind of job to pursue. Kahneman explains that the remembering self often misrepresents the experience. It tends to focus on the peak moments, the most intense part of an experience, and how it ends, while largely ignoring the duration. This is called the peak end rule. For example, imagine two people go through different medical procedures. The first person has 10 minutes of mild discomfort. The second person has 10 minutes of the same discomfort, followed by 5 more minutes that are slightly less painful. Surprisingly, the second person might report a better overall experience simply because it ended on a less painful note. Logically, more total discomfort should feel worse. But the remembering self judges based on the peak and the end, not the sum of pain over time. This is why someone might describe a long vacation with a few bad days at the end as worse than a short, perfect weekend, even if the long vacation had more total pleasure. The memory of the ending shapes the overall judgment. This distinction explains many puzzling behaviors. People may choose to repeat experiences that were not enjoyable throughout, simply because they ended well. Or they might avoid things that were mostly good, but ended badly. It also reveals how we misjudge happiness. The experiencing self might enjoy a peaceful, ordinary life. But the remembering self wants stories, achievements, and meaning, even if it causes stress. Consider someone who takes a high-paying but demanding job. Their daily life may be full of pressure, long hours, and little peace. The experiencing self suffers. But the remembering self might say, "I am successful," and feel satisfied. Or think of people who climb Mount Everest. The journey is freezing, painful, and exhausting. But the memory becomes a proud story. They may even want to do it again, not because it felt good at the time, but because the story it created was meaningful. Kahneman's point is not that one self is right and the other is wrong, but that we need to be aware of both. If we always follow the remembering self, we may make choices that sound good on paper, but feel bad in real life. If we only listen to the experiencing self, we may avoid challenges that give our life depth and purpose. This insight is powerful in areas like healthcare, education, travel, and public policy. For example, when designing patient care, hospitals can improve the ending of treatments even if they do not reduce the total discomfort, and patients will remember the experience more positively. When making life decisions, Kahneman suggests we ask, do I want to have this experience, or do I want to have the memory of this experience? This question helps clarify what we truly value. As the book closes, Kahneman reflects on the limitations of the human mind. We like to think we are in control, that we make decisions based on reason and logic. But the truth is, our minds are full of biases, shortcuts, and blind spots. These mental habits were shaped by evolution to help us survive, not to be perfectly rational. And yet, by studying these patterns, by observing how System 1 jumps to conclusions and how System 2 can be lazy or misled, we can become more aware of our own thinking. Awareness gives us a chance to pause, question, and improve. Kahneman does not promise that we can completely avoid bias. But he offers tools to reduce the damage they cause. We can slow down when it matters. We can consider the outside view instead of trusting our gut. We can use checklists, seek feedback, and design systems that compensate for human error. This mindset is already changing fields like medicine, law, investing, and government. More and more, leaders and professionals are recognizing that even the smartest people make flawed decisions, and that true wisdom comes from building structures that protect against those flaws. In our personal lives, these insights can help us become more forgiving of ourselves and of others. They show us that mistakes are not always due to laziness or carelessness. Sometimes, they are just the result of how our minds work. By understanding how we think and how we often misthink, we can live more consciously, more thoughtfully, and more compassionately. Kahneman's Thinking, Fast and Slow is not just a psychology book. It is a mirror. It shows us who we are, how we react, how we decide, how we fool ourselves, and invites us to grow beyond those patterns. And so, as we come to the end of Thinking, Fast and Slow, we are left with a deeper understanding of how our minds work and how they often work against us. Daniel Kahneman has taken us on a journey through the two systems of thinking: the fast, automatic reactions of System 1, and the slow, deliberate reasoning of System 2. We have seen how our judgments are shaped by hidden biases, how we make decisions based on emotions instead of logic, and how memory often distorts our experience. But above all, this book gives us a chance to pause and reflect. It teaches us to slow down when it matters, to question our assumptions, and to think not just quickly, but wisely. Whether we are managing money, navigating relationships, leading a team, or simply trying to make better choices in everyday life, understanding the machinery of our thoughts is the first step toward mastering them. At Books Arena, we believe in bringing such powerful books to life not just as summaries, but as meaningful stories filled with insights, real-life examples, and lessons we can apply. If this audiobook helped you see your mind in a new way, helped you become a bit more thoughtful, or made you reconsider how you make decisions, then it has done its job. Thank you for spending your time with us. Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep growing one book at a time. This is Books Arena, where great minds meet great books.